back to you.
Plenty happening. Helen Daly, thanks so much for that. We'll speak to you shortly. And joining me now is Liberal Democrat Senator David Leyonhjelm with me here in the studio. Now, you sit on the sidelines of this internal machinations that we've seen in Queensland at the moment. Senator Macfarlane, it wouldn't have passed you by this afternoon. His defection has been blocked to the Nationals. Just your reaction to that, do you think?
I'm not surprised on the face of it, and I'm just an observer on this, so I don't have any inside information. But on the face of it, it looked like a device to get back into the cabinet. He was deliberately dropped from the cabinet by Malcolm Turnbull, and to come in via the back door, via the numbers, would have seemed like Malcolm had been outsmarted. And I think everybody in his party is pretty protective of him at the moment. They don't want him to fail. So making him look weak like that, I think, was probably going against the grain.
Yes, I can tell you that his Liberal colleagues in Queensland are particularly unhappy about the attempted defection, but we will see where that all ends up. Now,
it would have been interesting if if the Liberals had got a Nat to leave the Nats and join the Liberals as well.
Well, that could have been
worked that way too.
You think you might be joining the Liberal Democrats? Is this an open invitation, perhaps? No.
No, you'd have to be a bit less agrarian socialist to join the Liberal Democrats.
Okay, we'll leave that one there. Now, I want to talk about MYEFO ahead of tomorrow. It's not going to be good news. We've seen commodity prices fall even further, slow wages growth. There's an extra $5 billion in spending, so there'll be a further deficit blowout. How understanding are you of the government's position at the moment?
Well, politically, I understand their situation, but that's not going to cut it. The reality is that we do have problems, as you mentioned. The budget's not in good shape. We're paying a fortune in interest costs on our debt. The deficit is huge and not getting brought under control at all. The thing that I find missing is the night that Malcolm Turnbull challenged Tony Abbott, he said, we need a narrative, an economic narrative. Got to convince the public that there is a problem and you know, we need to spend more time persuading. This last month, I suppose, we've had a public debate about whether to increase the GST, and if we're not going to increase the GST, what other tax might be increased? That's not a budget repair formula. Our problem is expenditure, not insufficient taxation. Malcolm Turnbull knows that, Scott Morrison knows that, Matthias Cormann know that, and yet there is no public narrative about, well, what are we going to do to bring expenditure under control? Well,
the narrative from economists seems to be the economy is in good shape, but the budget is not. So that comes down to a political solution. The crossbench can often be an impediment. It can often be, well, sometimes I should say, a help as well in terms of passing legislation. So I guess I want to know from you, going into 2016, do you put ideology to one side and look at, you know, the blanket issues, look at the macro problems and appreciate that the government needs to cut back on spending?
Yeah, I've always said I'll never vote for an increase in taxes. That's one of my guiding
Isn't that
philosophies.
part of the problem as well? What about if the overall, you know, tax take, as we keep on hearing from Scott Morrison, is lower all the same?
Yeah, that's different, yes.
Okay.
So
but the government have to demonstrate to you that that is what is happening.
Yeah, the government needs a case that says, well, if we increase the GST, we will reduce taxes by this amount and the overall tax burden will be reduced. I'd still need a lot of persuading, because once you start increasing the GST, it seems to be easier to put it up each time. I'd be much more comfortable with that sort of argument if they just broadened it to fresh food, for example, and that would still raise several $billion, and that went into, say, a reduction in company tax or a reduction in income tax, and the overall tax burden was reduced. I'd be much more comfortable with that. But we're not hearing that. We're hearing fiddles around the tax burden, but we have an expenditure problem. We're not hearing either the Prime Minister or the Treasurer or the Finance Minister or any of the other economic leaders of the government talking about our expenditure problem. And there are some expenditure issues that I think the government could politically talk about.
Which are?
middle class welfare. Middle class welfare is
Well,
an
they've tried
excellent...
that, haven't they? And it's almost impossible to get through the Senate. They've had to shelve many of those Abbott government policies. So
Labor claims to be the champion of the means test. All right, so if that's the case, it ought to be possible to negotiate reductions in expenditure by means testing some things. Now, they might not go as far as, say, means testing public hospitals or public schools, although I think there's a case for that. But the family tax benefit changes, for example, were all aimed at reducing middle class welfare. They were introduced by John Howard, so there's no Labor ownership of them. They were a SOP instead of tax cuts in that time. So that's another area. They won't tackle the issue of bringing housing, homes, valuable homes, into the assets test for the pension. They won't touch it. It's politically tricky. Now, if you're just going to avoid problems like that, you're not going to come up with solutions. You have to start talking about it. Now, you're never going to please everyone. So you have to accept the fact that somebody's going to scream at you, but others will say, yes, I see your problem, I see what you're talking about, even if I don't much like it.
Well, it's great when you talk about the conversation, but there's also the political reality of getting good senators like you on board with passing legislation. So just one final question, if I can ask you. Is there anything specific the government is talking to you about at the moment, and are you pleased with the way the new Turnbull government is engaging with you, negotiating with you?
Yes, they are talking to us about various bills. I'm not sure they'd want me to talk about them in great detail.
Please, at my invitation, please elaborate.
I think the ones that they probably are in the public domain would be registered organisations and the ABCC, re-establishing of the ABCC. As far as process goes, yes, they're talking to us more. In fact, they're talking to everyone more. I'm not sure if you noticed, but in the last 2 weeks, the last 2 sitting weeks, they've got quite a lot of bills through. That was in spite of some of my crossbench colleagues being highly obstructive, more opposition than the opposition. And they talked to the Greens in one instance, and they talked to Labor in several other instances. And their attitude now is, let's get something rather than nothing. It's a change of style. I think it's good. It means that more gets done, even if the perfect isn't achieved, or in their eyes, the perfect.
David Leyonhjelm, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show this afternoon. I'll see you probably in 2016 now, so thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure, thank you.
Quick break on PM Agenda. We'll be back in a moment.